This is Look West, a podcast from California's Assembly Democrats.
Sometimes politics is a family affair. Since the state legislature began, there have been 47 children of state lawmakers who also ended up serving in the state legislature. 5 current California lawmakers have a parent who also served in the state legislature. In the Assembly, there's the Ramblas, the Burks, the Holdens, and the Mullins. I'm Bob Shaleen with Look West. On this episode, we're going to hear from current Assembly Speaker Pro Tem Kevin Mullin. His dad, Gene, represented the same South San Francisco district from 2002 to 2008. The Mullin family has been part of the South San Francisco community for almost 100 years. They know the neighborhood, and Kevin and Gene also know the state capitol. Let's listen in as they talk about their unique perspective on South San Francisco and the state legislature over the years.
My guest across the table is my father, former assembly member, former city council member here in our hometown of South San Francisco, Gene Mullin. And we are celebrating Youth in Government Day here in South San Francisco, which is a program that my father started where young people from our local high schools here in the city shadow local government counterparts and learn all of the inner workings of local government. And Dad, you were a government and civics teacher mostly for the 32 years you were at South San Francisco High School. Did you teach another kind of a course besides civics and government?
When you're a high school teacher, you kind of have a wide expanse of different subjects. I taught English. I have an English minor from college. I taught economics. I taught U.S. history, world history. I taught PE a little bit because I was a coach for almost 25 years. I taught a few classes PE. But by and large, social studies. I'm a poli-sci major from college, and I would say at least 25 years of the 32 were teaching government, which is the kind of the capstone course for seniors in high school. It's a required to graduate course, and so I was always the last barrier to walking across the stage, so it gave me a little control over the kids.
Yeah. So you were a coach, basketball coach, the varsity coach at South City High School.
Correct.
When you look back on your career, was that talk about how sort of rewarding that was to participate both on the athletic side, but also the classroom side, and beyond sort of generating some memories. What did that experience on the athletic side? How did that inform what you did in the classroom, if at all?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. A lot of coaches at all levels are coaches first and teachers second. In my case, I was a teacher who wound up as a coach, and so teaching was sort of the primary motivation. I'd always played athletics and was interested, and when I interviewed, one of the requests was, would I have the ability to coach basketball if I got the job? And so I interviewed at several. In fact, I did my student teaching in San Francisco and was offered a job and a coaching job there. But my aunt had been a longtime employee in South San Francisco. She said, why don't you come down and interview there? You might find it interesting. So I did. And I interviewed with the principal at the time of South San Francisco High School, Louis Bagnall, and he asked, first question he asked was, can you coach? Because finding coaches then, as now, is difficult. And I said, sure, I would have said yes to anything. If he had said, can you do the cheerleaders and can you run the dance company, I probably would have said yes because I wanted to get a job.
No, you wanted to be a lawyer though.
I did a year of law school at night and worked full time during the day, and the grind was too much. And I thought, I don't know if I want to continue to do this. I always in the back of my mind had a thought about being a teacher. And so after a year of law school, I kind of had that decision-making time. Am I going to continue? And it was just so hard. 5 nights a week in law school and 5 nights a week working full-time in the daytime. It was just too much. So I could do education school and still work full time. It was less of a difficulty at night. And there was an immediacy. Back in the 60s, there was a need for teachers. It was very competitive. It's like it is now. You could pretty much, if you could get your credential, you could find a job. And so that was sort of the motivation.
So you choose South San Francisco. Well, more to the point, South San Francisco chooses you in a way, but you're able to buy a home in this middle-class community. For those listening around the state who aren't familiar with South San Francisco, who hear San Francisco and think San Francisco, describe this community for our listeners around the state.
Sure. South San Francisco, we have a motto that's on what we call Sign Hill. It says South San Francisco, the industrial city, which is really what it had been prior to the advent of the biosciences coming into our community in the mid-'70s. It was a industrial, working-class, blue-collar community of about 35 or 40,000 people. When we moved down here, we rented a house for 3 years, and then we bought a house 2 doors up the street. We made the move in my daughter's little red wagon, and we moved into that house 50 years ago. It was going to be our starter house. We paid less than $28,000 for it, which still was a stretch. I think I was earning maybe $13,000 a year at that time, something in that neighborhood. So, but it was still within reason, and so we were able to purchase in a community. And most of my colleagues in the school district lived locally. A lot of them were preceding graduates from the schools, and so there's a real sense of community that, unfortunately, to a great degree, is lost as the home prices have spiraled well beyond the ability of most classroom teachers and administrators to actually live in a community where they teach.
Right. So I won't dwell on this, but take us back to the 1970s when you were getting started here in this community. Before the biotechnology industry discovered South City,
Right.
What was this community like economically? I mean, it's the industrial city.
Right.
And still is. But what was happening economically here in this community? And what was the sort of, what were the prospects for this community before Genentech really founded an industry right here in our town?
We were, I think, a West Coast version of the Rust Belt. We had a large industrial area that was going to seed. We had lost a lot of the industries that had proliferated during the war and immediately after. We were an ethnic community, mostly Italians, with some Hispanic population, but primarily an Italian community. When I say blue collar, working class, I mean, it really was, that was the characteristics of the community as a whole.
And we're in the shadow of SFO, so there were lots of airport workers, for example, that lived in South San Francisco.
I believe that United Airlines, which had its maintenance base, we had a lot of mechanics that worked there. I think that United Airlines and the airport as a whole was the primary employer for our community. United Airlines, by the way, subsequently moved their maintenance facility out of the area, and that cost us a lot of jobs at that time. So we had the prospects were a little dim, frankly, but it was a very strong community with a long history, and it was a very welcoming community. Now, of course, I've lived here for 50 years. I'm still a bit of a newcomer to some of the old timers, but it has become much more ethnically diverse as time has passed, and but it's a great place to live. Our reputation was not stellar in the Bay Area communities. I think of the 50 Bay Area communities, we were ranked 47th, something of that nature. That was before the bioscience established itself. We've obviously become gentrified to a great degree since then, but I felt very comfortable. The kids, there's a great involvement of parents in the schools, but like almost like a tradition that the parents said, we give our kids to you. We're not going to interfere with what you do. We're going to trust that you're going to do a good job with them, and that made it a very satisfying career. You didn't have to battle parents; they were pretty supportive all the way through.
And your father, my grandfather, did what for a living?
He was a machinist, and he worked in both the breweries initially, and then with Phillips and Van Orden's, the world's largest printing company, and he became the plant superintendent of that. And so he was a blue-collar worker. Your great-grandfather, my grandfather, was a blacksmith in South San Francisco, by the way. I have to say that was one of the motivations, the fact that my grandfather and his family, including my father and his brothers and sister, moved into South San Francisco in 1913. And then my aunt, when they moved to San Francisco in 1926, my aunt stayed. She was a teacher and a principal, and when she retired, I came here. So we've had a presence either working or living in a community for over 100 years now. And I take a little pride in that. I mean, it makes me really feel as though this is my hometown, and I'm zealously guarding its reputation.
And your mom, my Nana, what did she do for a living?
My mother graduated from Commerce High School at age 15. She skipped, back in those days, you could skip grades routinely. She went to work at age 15 as a secretary to one of the developers, one of the builders and designers of the Golden Gate Bridge, and worked as a secretary for until she married my father when she was 23. And she became a homemaker to my sister and me, and in many ways, very literate person. She really installed a love of reading and of education with us, and I think we owe our whatever success to both of them, but to her as being that guiding force there all the time.
So, 32-year teacher and coach in South San Francisco, you saw this community become the biotechnology capital of the world, 200 plus biotechnology companies. You are participating in local commissions, but you don't run for office until your mid-50s. Right. Looking back, having the perspective of time, looking back on your career, why didn't you run for office in your 30s or 40s? Why did you wait till the later part of your career?
Well, I had children in the home. I was teaching and I was coaching 2 or 3 seasons, which meant that it was a full day. And then during the summertime, given the fact that teachers don't make a lot of money, even then, while we were more competitive, it was still a grind. Your mother, my wife, did not work out of the house, so I was the sole income. And so each summer I would work different jobs, and I don't think ever had the time to consider a political career. Now, if I look back on it, I probably, if I had a do-over, would probably have looked at elective office a little sooner than I did. But as it turned out, it was just perfect, ideal situation for me.
So I joke around that I've been involved in politics longer than my father, which is not technically accurate, but I was an aide to Jackie Spear when she was a state assemblywoman. When my father came in to meet with her in advance of his city council race. So I was already a political aide and staffer while he was getting ready to be a first-time candidate. So I try to hold that over him. The truth is he's been involved, civically in the 70s. But I would say really growing up the son of a civics teacher and seeing his students get involved directly in local government, that really did open up my eyes to the possibility of government service. The truth is I wanted to go in the media. I wanted to be a journalist here in the Bay Area. That's what I studied in college, and sort of fell into democratic politics in a way, but there's no question that having grown up the son of a government teacher eventually would steer me in that direction, and then seeing his experience on the city council. And the reality is it made it very accessible, having known my father, that he could be on the city council and become a mayor, and I was his campaign manager for the state assembly and felt very invested in his success in Sacramento. I think that made it pretty clear to me that the barrier is not something that is insurmountable, that I could probably pursue that as well. But I'm also very mindful of the advantages that I had having my father as a mentor and having Jackie Spear as a mentor. And not everybody clearly has those kinds of opportunities. So in a way, I have great respect for my colleagues who don't have the advantages that I had in getting involved politically and who come from across the state of California, from families without the advantages that mine. And for those, for my colleagues to wind up in Sacramento, having not had some of those political advantages is really pretty remarkable. And I have great respect for my colleagues who've overcome much more than I have to make it to Sacramento.
It's interesting. I want to add, when I was teaching government in the 90s, Jackie Spear had her office in South San Francisco within walking distance of the school. And Quentin Kopp, the state senator, had his offices also in South San Francisco and also within walking distance. So it was my practice to take each class and to go to Jackie's office. We'd walk across the football field by Bimbo Bakery and into and have her or her staff, usually her staff because she was in Sacramento most of the time, but get a hands-on experience. And then we'd go to Quentin Kopp's office. And in fact, as it turned out, my first district director had worked for Quentin Kopp, and that's where I met her at the time. So we had generations of kids actually in the offices, and we went to Sacramento too from time to time, but this was within one class period you could do it. And we had courts in South San Francisco. We could walk to the courts, and that took 2 periods, so I had to kind of maneuver that, but we'd go up and sit in the courts. So it was a great experience for them and for me because that's how I got to know Jackie closely, even though Kevin had worked for her. I mean, I really didn't know her. And it was when I went in to ask her for her endorsement for city council that she said, well, why don't you think about running for the state assembly? So that led to my spending a couple days following her. Again, and she did endorse me for city council, and she's been a mentoress to both Kevin and to me over the years. She's been terrific.
So you're a city council member, mayor. We talked a little bit earlier about your election to the state assembly. You were chair of the education committee in the assembly. Just one question about our K-12 system and your perspective as both a teacher in the classroom, but also as a policymaker in Sacramento. What presents the biggest hurdle or challenge to building the kind of a K-12 system that we want for our young people across the state?
Well, it's important to remember that California is like a nation state. 40 million people. We have 6.3 million youngsters in K-12 education, so it's a huge system. I was there. I was in the assembly from 2002 to 2008, in the throes of an economic disaster. So we were always trying to figure out ways to make payday, so to speak. In terms of the overall single cure for education, it would be to equalize funding. In California, about of the more than 1,000 school districts, the preponderance of them are state funded. They get money from the state, and that constitutes, I'm not sure of the exact amount, but something between $8,000 and $10,000 per student per year. The balance of the school districts are what we call revenue limit districts. They self-fund. And so you find dramatic differences in how much money is allocated to each student based on the economic background of the community in which those schools are found. So the short answer is we spend huge amounts of money proportionally in some school districts and dramatically less in others. And usually the ones that spend less are those that don't have the economic resources. So they've got a double whammy. They don't have as much money, and they have kids of a background that are not going to receive as much support in the homes as those from the high wealth districts. So how you go about doing that is the trick. The local control funding formula that Governor Brown started makes a stab at that, and that's good. And don't think that hasn't made a difference, but it's still woefully short of the inequities we find in funding. Yeah, and then you take the natural extension of that is if you are a less funded district, it means your staff is going to be paid less. And if the staff happens to be in proximity to other districts with higher income, you're going to have a high turnover, and so you get that the shift of personnel, and so you don't have the stability that is essential, I think, in the continuity that makes education more effective. And then you toss in, if you want, the high cost of housing, which exacerbates the turnover you find in lower paid districts, and it really becomes a challenge. Not one you shouldn't accept, but one that has no easy fixes. So I think the funding and the turnover in personnel were the two major issues I faced as the education chair.
So back on your journey from the classroom to the Capitol, Mr. Mullin goes to Sacramento.
Right.
So how
I
did
watch that movie every few weeks just to recharge my batteries.
Right. So how did the world of Sacramento partisan politics compare with the sort of idealized notion of government that I'm sure you probably tried to instill in the young people that came to the 10,000, some 13,000 students that came through your classroom over 30 plus years?
Well, I did not want to idealize government. However, I didn't want to be cynical about it, because cynicism about government is rampant, and it was rampant even when I started in the 60s. And so I wanted to make it, I think, a more rational view of it. Was it different when I went to the Capitol? To a degree, but part of my career is I spent 13 years teaching a summer program at Cal State Sacramento and doing teacher training. And as part of that, we would spend time in the Capitol. So I had started doing that in my late 80s, going to Sacramento in the summertime. And so I was I'd sat in on a lot of committee hearings and kind of had a more, I guess, realistic view. But I will say this, I was always kind of in awe of the elected officials. I mean, it just felt, if you saw one walking down the corridor, you go, oh, gee, there's an elected official. And so I was a little bit awestruck, even though I was in my 60s, about people who went through the process to actually get there. And when I became an elected official, I appreciated the fact that it's a very small group of people that are able to be decision makers for the nation state of California. I never, ever took anything for granted. That it was an honor to be there, and it was a responsibility as well.
So we heard from young people earlier today and Youth in Government Day here in South San Francisco, and you have spent considerable time encouraging young people to get involved in not even so much politics, but at least opening their world to the prospects of public service and civic engagement. And as we know, there's all sorts of paths to serving a community. But do you worry about how our young people perceive politics? Even the word politics sometimes can be something of a bad word to people and a negative just on mention. And democratic engagement, small d democratic engagement, by witnessing some of the divisiveness we see, mostly on the federal level. I like to compare our relative civility in Sacramento to some of the stuff we see on the national level. But those are what happens on the federal level, national level, is where a lot of people, young people, get their messages about what it's like to be involved in political life. What is an antidote to that negativity and that divisiveness, and does that concern you as somebody who's been an observer for decades?
Yeah, it does concern me. I think the advent of the pervasiveness of social media has, and this is, again, when I retired in 1999 from the classroom, social media really didn't exist. And so the 24 news cycle was starting to take place, but you could still have reasonable conversations. The newspapers meant more now than they do now. And so I think the role of a teacher was greater at that time because it was one of a relatively small group of influences on young people. Again, I mentioned earlier, I didn't want to ever be cynical because cynicism was starting to grow. I also taught history over the years, and so there were many cynical periods in our history, and it's cyclical. But I could see it coming in the 70s and 80s. Watergate sort of turned a lot of kids off to politics. But I think you have to be a voice of reason, and that is that it is a system. The system is geared to the quality of people that operate the system, and the quality of people are generated by who votes, who supports them. We did a lot of activities that took kids actually out of the classroom. We did candidates fairs where I would require my seniors to work 2 hours in a candidate of their choice, and we would bring all of the offices that were being contested into the school. We would have them interviewed, we would have them debate, and then the kids would sign up to get them actively involved, even if it was stuffing envelopes or walking precincts, but they were required to do that. Now, if there was a pushback, there was an alternative assignment, but all the kids, with rare exception, did their 2 hours with their candidate to get a sort of a hands-on feel. I would take my kids to city council meetings, require them to go, and I would go with them, but contrary to what you see now, I would bring in a city council member or a staff person before the meeting, and we would go over the agenda so that the kids, when they would see the council meeting or the board of supervisors, they would know what the issues were, at least to the degree that they'd be able to follow. I can remember being in venues where kids would come in and they'd walk out and say, that was the most boring thing I ever saw, I'm never going back, because it was a mystery. They weren't prepared for what they were going to see. And so we did a lot of pre-preparation so that it had some meaning for them when they actually went to whether the Board of Supervisors, whether it was the criminal courts, the civil. We were out of the classroom more than we were in the classroom, which I think made the kids happy. I know it made the teacher happy.
So, what is a day in the life of Gene Mullin in 2019?
Well, I'm working on a civic education project for the San Mateo County Office of Education in terms of how to generate more civic participation in the schools. And so I'm working on that as a project. I'm using some of the experiences I had as a teacher to try to infuse those into whatever our policy is going to be. I've worked with both our local county as well as Sacramento County in developing programs for that. I'm on the board of Seton Medical Center, which we're just coming out of bankruptcy and it's been sold to a new operator. I'm on the board of the local museum, historical museum. I'm on the board of HIP Housing to generate more housing activity. I'm on the board of the Library Bond Foundation to build a new library. And most of the time I spend walking the dog that used to be yours that now spends a lot of time in my house since you now have 15-month-old sons.
Thanks for that, by the way.
Yeah.
So your civic engagement clearly continues.
Right.
As you look back on your life and career, what are you most proud of?
Well, I'm proud of my family. My children have both been very successful. My grandkids are successful. I think I had a successful career. I remember when I first went to Sacramento and we hired staff, they said, "Now, what do you want to be known for after you leave after 6 years?" And I said, "I want to be known for consistency. I want to make sure that when I go up there, I'm going to be there all the time." And so when I left, the day I left, somebody called me the Cal Ripken of the California Assembly. I never missed a floor session. I never missed a committee hearing. And in fact, I stood in or sat in for many other members who asked me to substitute for them on other committees. And it got to the point where toward the end I said, I wonder if I can actually sit in on every committee. I think there were 29 at the time. Well, I didn't make all 29, but I made a lot of them. So I never embarrassed my constituents, always was prepared, and look back with fondness on that. But again, I have no regrets with the way my career went, and still out there trying to catch the elusive rainbow trout at Tioga Pass in Yosemite.
I look forward to joining you. Thanks a lot, Dad.
You're welcome.
The Look West podcast is produced by the California Assembly Democrats. Please subscribe and rate this show wherever you get your favorite podcasts. And when you think of California and politics, remember to look west.